Well, welcome to an introduction to reading theory. I want to acknowledge our sponsor, the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. And first, what I want to do is tell you a little bit about myself. So my training is in psychology. I call myself a developmental psychologist interested in children and how they develop. But then because I apply that knowledge to schools, I'm also an educational psychologist. I've been doing research in the area of deaf and hard of hearing children for over 30 years. I've published in a lot of different areas: attachment, mother-child interaction, peer relations, recently much more into vocabulary and literacy. And so that's where I've been focused for the last 10 years. And as part of that is being PI on 2 federally funded grants, Foundations for Literacy and Center on Literacy and Deafness. So CLAD, or the Center on Literacy and Deafness, is a national research and development center funded by the Institute of Education Sciences of the U.S. Department of Education. Much of my ideas in this webinar have been discussed at length with the other researchers in the center and who are part of this webinar series. These others include Drs. Easterbrook, Antia, Schick, Connor, and Tucci. I'm going to use my talk to give you a big picture of the theoretical framework for how we think of reading of deaf children and refer you to their webinars for a more in-depth view of different components of the reading process. So, what will you learn? First, you're going to learn a model of reading. You're going to be introduced to terminology and concepts important to the theory. And we're going to look at some of the complex skills involved in reading. We're going to look at how reading changes with age and ability, and also try to talk about how we apply this reading theory to deaf and hard of hearing children. So let's first start about what is reading. Well, what can expert readers do? They can quickly and automatically recognize printed words. They can integrate meaning of words and phrases. They can construct meaning in an ongoing manner as they read quickly and fluently. They can learn the information presented in the text, store that information, integrate it with what they know, and answer questions. So, reading is complex. In fact, people call it rocket science. Uh-oh, how do we do this? Well, one way that we can sort of get our heads wrapped around reading is through something called the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is really simple, but it's very, very useful as a framework for thinking about reading. And essentially, it's a formula that says, in order for reading comprehension to happen, you need 2 things. There are 2 very important components: printed word recognition and language comprehension, and that the relationship between them is multiplicative. That is, that reading comprehension is printed word recognition times language comprehension. So what does that mean? It means that if you don't have either one of these skills, you can't understand what you read. So if you don't recognize the words, there's no reading comprehension. If you recognize the words, but you don't understand what you've read, there's no reading comprehension. They're both equally important and crucial for you to be able to read what you understand, which is the goal of reading. So let's take some extreme examples to get this idea. There are many Jewish kids in the United States and elsewhere who learn to read Hebrew so they can pass their bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah. They learn to read the characters of Hebrew phonetically, and they do it beautifully. You listen to them, they're reading because they have excellent print word recognition in Hebrew. But they don't know anything about Hebrew. They have no language comprehension, and so they don't know what they're reading. So that's an extreme example of where you get print word recognition, but no language comprehension. So no reading comprehension, just word calling is what we might call it. The other example are children and adults who are non-readers. These are people who are illiterate. So they may have lots of language. If you talk to them, if you sign to them, they can discuss things, they can understand things, they can understand a story that you've read to them. But because they do not have print word recognition, they have no reading comprehension. If you put something in front of them, they will not be able to understand it. Even if you read it out loud, they would be able to understand it because they have language. But they don't have print recognition, so no reading comprehension. So that's what the simple view reading means. Now let's go through it more slowly to look at each of those two important component processes. The first component process that we're going to talk about in more depth is print word recognition. So, what is print word recognition? It's the connection between a printed word and a spoken or signed word. Doesn't matter if it's spoken or signed, you have to connect what the print is into your language that you know. Now, there are a lot of synonyms to this. You can call this word reading, you can call it decoding, word identification. I say this because people use these words interchangeably, and I don't want you to be misled to think that they're meaning something else. So the simple example on your slide is the word cat. For all of us, it brings up a picture of a cat. So we know what that word means. And we also have a spoken or signed word that's connected to it. So there are two principal ways in which we engage in word recognition. Sight words, or we apply a strategy which leads to decoding the words. Let's talk about each one of these in turn. So sight words are words that are recognized automatically. That is, you know the meaning and automatically associate or quickly associate the spoken or signed word without thought or effort when you see that word. So the next slide, I want you to do something. I want you to sit and read the colors of the words. Okay, let's go. Now what I want you to do is read the words as they're written. So reading the words is much easier, isn't it? Well, that's because for expert readers like us, the printed word are all sight words, and they're so automatic that you can't ignore the print and pay attention to color. By the way, this is a famous psychology test called the Stroop test that was devised just for that purpose, to show how automatic word recognition is for people who are good readers. Sight words are efficient and must occur for true fluent reading to happen. It is the end goal of reading, is to have all words as sight words. And so if you look at the next picture, you can think of word reading as an automatic association between the printed word, the sign or spoken word, and the meaning. Now, a couple of things to talk about. One is that it would be nice if you could go directly from print to meaning, because after all, the whole point of reading is to comprehend what you've read. But it turns out a lot of research shows that we don't do that. We actually go through either pronunciation or the sign articulation in order to get to meaning, that these three things are unitized or automatically associated in sight word reading, and that you can't skip any one of these components. So one of the things also is to think about the goal of reading is to make print automatic, and to quickly associate it with the pronunciation or articulation of the sign as well as the meaning, to make this triangle as a unit in long-term memory. So, what if you don't have a word as a sight word? After all, that happens all the time. What can you do? Well, you use what we call a strategy. You have a way in which you can try to figure out what that word is. One common way is to guess. You guess from context. You can use a picture. You could use the fact that the teacher has already told you the story, that you already know the story. Maybe you have the story memorized. You don't recognize that word, but you're going to guess what it is. Well, that can work, but the truth is, if you only use semantics or a picture to guess what the word is, frequently you're wrong, and you're not actually reading the word, and it will never get you to that sight word. It will just be a guess. So you need other strategies that are more effective in making that word a sight word. So one thing is phonological recoding, which is the most powerful strategy hearing children have to identify words. So what you do with phonological recoding is you sound out each letter or chunks of letters into spoken phonemes and then blend it into a word. So take a moment to figure out what strategy you would use to recognize this unfamiliar name. So I don't know about you, but what I would have done is looked at this word and sort of try to muddle out. I'm hearing impaired, so I have to tell you I'm not very good at phonics, but I would look at it and say, the first two letters look like Vi, so I'm going to try that. And then the last four letters may be another syllable, and maybe it's that long last E makes a long E. Let's see, Beck. And so now I've chunked this word into two syllables, and I have transferred it into a pronunciation, which then gets stored in my long-term memory. So it not only gives me, phonological recoding gives me a way in which to not just sit and try to memorize the letters that are part of this word, but to transform it into my spoken phonology, which makes it much easier for me to remember it. It also, so phonological recoding is a strategy. If you've ever looked at beginning readers, it's a strategy that's used almost all the time because they don't have a lot of sight words. When they come across a word, they sound it out and try to blend it together. In addition to being able to use a pretty effective strategy to decode words, phonological recoding is a way for creating and storing new sight words. So a psychologist named Linnea Airy has shown a lot of evidence that shows that sight words, most sight words become sight words through phonological recoding, that after you've done it over and over again, eventually that word becomes a sight word. So what's the next component of simple view of reading? It's language comprehension, which, as we all know, is very complex. So language comprehension is defined as the ability to understand through the air language, that is spoken or sign language. It doesn't matter what the language is, it's language. So here's these English sentences. The little girl is hugging the goat. The goat is being hugged by the little girl. If you have good language comprehension, you would understand that both those sentences have the same meaning, and they refer to something like the picture on the page. So what are the different skills involved in language comprehension? Well, you got vocabulary, you have grammar or sentence understanding, you have background knowledge, and you have verbal reasoning skills. There are a ton others, but those are the four that most people talk about. So you got printed word recognition, you got language comprehension. What happens? Reading comprehension, which is the ability to understand written language. And that, again, depends on the ability to turn print into language. Now it's time for you to think about what we've been talking about and apply your knowledge. So what I want you to do is you'll be reading a reading passage that I'll put on a slide, and I want you to think about the role of word recognition, sight word recognition, strategies for reading words, language comprehension, vocabulary, grammatical understanding, background knowledge, verbal reasoning skills. I want you to think about it and keep a particular deaf child that you have in mind, that you know how they might approach this reading passage. Now, to expand on this, some of the questions that you might ask yourself are, what words might not be sight words? How would the child read them? What words might the child be able to decode but not know? So what might be vocabulary problems? What sentences may be a struggle for a child who does not have a strong knowledge of English syntax? And what background knowledge is necessary to understand the passage? What I want you to do is write down your answers to these questions. Okay, now move on to the next slide. When you're done reading this passage and writing down your answers, why don't you move on to the next slide? Okay, now that we have a basic understanding of the simple view of reading, what I want to do is just talk briefly about implications of the simple view of reading. So what we've said is that strong reading comprehension can only occur if both word reading and language skills are strong. Children can't bypass learning to code words even if they have strong language skills. So you have a child who's just struggling with reading, and you think, oh, if I just get enough vocabulary, and if I just get them real strong language skills, that will transfer to reading. It won't. It won't unless we figure out how to get that child to read words. Decoding and language are separable for both assessment and teaching. So when you're assessing a child in their reading abilities, make sure that you assess both their word recognition or decoding abilities and their language. And then, once you've figured out where their problems are, target your intervention to those particular problems. So one thing that Dr. Connor's webinar will talk to you about is child by instruction interactions, where your instruction should be tailored to the child's strengths and weaknesses. So if their weaknesses is on word recognition, that's where you should be spending your time in your reading block. If it's in language, but they have good word recognition, then you should be spending your time on language. Or maybe you need both. So I'm sure Dr. Connor will go into detail on this. Okay, so now that we've been talking about simple view reading, mostly about hearing children, I want to turn and talk a little bit about deaf children for the rest of the talk. We all have to acknowledge that deaf children differ along many dimensions that affect how they read. One major difference is their speech perception abilities. Some children have sufficient speech perception abilities to give them auditory access to spoken language. That means that they're forming spoken phonological representations of words and sentences. So we refer to these children as having functional hearing. Children who have functional hearing may be acquiring spoken language, or they may be acquiring sign language. Other children without functional hearing are only acquiring sign language, and we think these all affect reading processes. In fact, CLAD has taken the hypothesis that deaf children who are acquiring spoken English use similar reading processes as hearing children, but deaf children who are acquiring sign use alternative visually based pathways to read. And so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking a little bit more in depth about what that means. So if you look at the next slide, deaf children who have functional hearing and no spoken English, in the context of the simple view of reading, are doing word reading and language. And what I put above those big components are the skills, the sub-skills that are important for that to happen. So let's start with word reading. We know in order for children to read words, they need to have two things. They need to understand letters, and they also need to have spoken phonological awareness. Spoken phonological awareness is an awareness and an ability to manipulate the sounds of the language, the phonemes of the words. So we've already talked about phonological recoding as a powerful strategy. If you think about it, what you have to do is, let's take the word cat. You have to know that cat has 3 phonemes, ka, a, t. And then you have to be able to blend those phonemes into a word, cat, and recognize, that's cat. That's that little animal that I know. So those are all phonological awareness. And it does not come naturally. It is not part of knowing how to say that word. It's actually an additional skill. It's what's called a metalinguistic skill, being aware and being able to manipulate those skills. Things like segmenting, rhyming, blending are all different kinds of phonological awareness skills. And in order to be able to decode, you have to take your spoken phonological awareness and combine it with your alphabetic knowledge and put it together to do word reading. And that is the same for hearing children as for children who have functional hearing and no spoken English, because they're acquiring those spoken phonological representations through the air, through their language. And what reading is going to do is allow them to become more cognizant of those underlying phonemes. Now, under language, I simplified it from the previous subskills, but clearly vocabulary and English syntax are part of language. So we can see that this model is based on the model that we've developed for hearing children. But if you go on to the next slide and look at deaf children who know sign, they're different. And I put blue circles in here to show you how that may be different from children who have functional hearing and hearing children. For both of them, you need word reading and language. That simple view of reading stays the same for all children, but how you get there may differ. So for word reading, instead of spoken phonology, Children may be able to use fingerspelling. Some people believe that they use sign phonology, and they combine that with their alphabetic knowledge in order to do word reading. For language, it's the complexity of bilingualism, where their knowledge of English and their knowledge of sign language both work together in the language component, but how they work together is a complex phenomena, which we will talk more later. So now what I want to do is talk about how children learn to read. We've been talking somewhat about an expert reader. I've given examples of children learning to read, but let's talk a little bit more and I'm going to give you some models about what happens in reading development. A very well-known theory about reading is by Schall, and she came up with stages of reading. I'm only going to do 3 of them here because we're focused on early reading. So what she talked about is during preschool, at a time where we call these children emergent readers because they're not really reading yet, typically. 2 very important things are happening. First, language is a priority. Children in preschool are developing syntax, they're developing vocabulary, they're learning how to use their language, they're learning how to tell a story, they're learning as you read stories to them, they're learning the structure of stories, they're learning comprehension strategies as you talk to them and sign to them. They're also frequently learning alphabetic knowledge, so letter sound and letter name knowledge is something that develops during preschool. But learning to read typically is postponed until kindergarten through 3rd grade. But in kindergarten through 3rd grade, reading and language are developing separately. So if you think again about the simple view of reading, the child may be making advances on print recognition and language, but their language is usually much, much better than their reading. And the word recognition is the primary limit to reading. So if you talk about what books are they understanding, you will notice that during story time, when the teacher reads to the children in the room, those books are much more complex. The language is more complex, the vocabulary is more complex, and the child can answer questions about those complex ideas. But once you put it into print, there's a much, much more restricted level of understanding if the child is expected to read it themselves, because it's limited by their sight word recognition and also their fluency of being able to put those words together into meaningful sentences. So during kindergarten through 3rd grade, we call those years learning to read. Now, in the later grades, children read to learn, and at least that's for good readers. So usually reading comprehension and language comprehension become much more similar, and that they actually read science textbooks to get information. They read social studies textbooks to get information about history. They don't have to have the teachers tell them that information because their reading comprehension is better. Obviously, that's an ideal if you have developed reading to the level that they can do that. So now let me just give you a little moment for you to look at this model that's in front of you called the Scarborough rote model. Again, Hollis Scarborough uses the simple view of reading to organize what the information she's presenting. So you can see on the top, language comprehension, and you can see all of the sub-skills we've talked about: background knowledge, vocabulary, language, verbal reasoning. Under word recognition, we have phonological awareness, decoding, sight recognition. And one of the things the rote model gives you is the idea, if you think about across the slide, we're talking about age. So initially, in preschool, early elementary, each one of those sub-skills are somewhat separate. They're correlated, they're related, but they're developing as separate pieces of the rope. And as children develop, as they become better readers, though all of those little pieces become more and more integrated. So by 4th grade, you're getting the 2 bits, word recognition and language comprehension, coming together. And by adulthood, they're totally enmeshed. And that is skilled reading. And so if you think about your young children, they may have all these sub-skills in different areas, and your job is to make it fluent, to make it integrated, and to get them to that skilled reading. So now we have a model for reading. I know what areas where children may struggle or pose a challenge for deaf children. But how do children learn to read? Well, we've had some national panels who've looked at a lot of research with hearing children, and they've come to some major conclusions, which perhaps isn't surprising. That reading is a learned skill. It doesn't happen naturally. It's very different from language. Language, even though deaf children may struggle, they struggle because they don't have access to language or because they were late identified and they did not have a strong language environment, which makes language challenging. But once they're in an environment with language, they pretty readily pick it up. What they can't do is readily pick up reading. Reading is a learned skill, and it's very much dependent on instruction. And it's dependent on the quality of instruction. Each component is individually important, and the synergy between the components are also important. So teachers have a major job in teaching reading. Now, what I want to turn to is to talk a little bit about some specifics about what we think the reading processes are in learning to read for deaf children with functional hearing and who are acquiring spoken English. I'll later talk about children who are acquiring sign. So when you think about instruction that's relevant for word reading, a traditional way for all children have been a look and say. So we emphasize sight word reading, you use flashcards, and you try to get right where we want them to be as expert readers, getting them to memorize those words. Well, there's a real problem with that approach to reading. It's very slow. You don't acquire enough words that way. Words are very easily confused visually. Bet and get, if you forget about how it's pronounced and you just look at the orthography, the letters, it's pretty confusing. B and G, it's the only difference, and they're very similar. So children mix up their words if all they're doing is trying to memorize what that word looks like. And even maybe more importantly, there's no strategy when they're encountering words that they don't have as sight words, except to guess by the picture or context. And for early reading, that's almost all their words. So they're really stuck when you put a word in a passage in front of them. So you can see here on this picture, a teacher who was very wedded to the notion of flashcards. And she's trying to have the child memorize, do you think 100 words from those flashcards? Very difficult. So, okay, here it is. What's the word? Tell me the word. And put it away and sort it into piles of words they don't know and they do know, and then have them study them. It's not a very effective way to teach reading. You may need to do that for a few words, but if that's the only strategy, children will always struggle to learn to read, for most children. So what's the alternative? Well, for children who are acquiring spoken language, what you really need to be doing is teaching them the alphabetic principle. Now, what is the alphabetic principle? It's the relations between the phonemes or sounds of the words that they know and the letters of the printed word. And that those relations, in fact, are rule-governed. They're not transparent. It's not a one-to-one relationship between letters and sounds, except for simple three-letter words like cat. But for many words, there is a relationship between the pronunciation of that word and the letters. And what phonics instruction does is teach children explicitly to map the phonemes of their language onto the letter. So explicitly how you use phonological recoding, cat. Also writing words using the alphabetic principle, having children sound out the word that they want to write and then write it down phonetically. Even if it's spelled wrong, it helps them figure out the alphabetic principle. Now that, we've been talking about pretty simple alphabetic principle, but in fact, the alphabetic principle can get more and more complex. So if you look on the next page, you can see that letters get chunked into their phonemes, and that children have to learn that stop has 4 phonemes, check has 3, and that CH makes ch, CK makes k, giggle, obviously, G and GG make the same sound, bird, IR makes So all of these different things are clearly complex and take a long time to develop. So when we say kindergarten through 3rd grade is learning to read, for English-speaking children, what we're saying is that's the period of time that takes them to learn this phonology of the language and to map it onto the orthography or the letters. One thing it allows you to do is phonology allows you to see those printed words in these chunks. So no longer is giggle 5 letters, it's actually 4 chunks. Check is only 3 chunks. It makes things much easier to process, to put into long-term memory, and to organize. So this is a very powerful principle, and all children who are using spoken language need to develop it. So let's go back to what our simple model was of word recognition. Before, we had 3 components to printed words, pronunciation, and meaning. Now, what I've done here on this slide is to add the 4th component that we've been talking about, the letter-phoneme correspondences. And so word recognition really is a process of learning printed words, letter sound or letter-phoneme correspondences, pronunciation, and meaning. Even if you don't phonologically recode, what research suggests is that children are storing and using those letter sound correspondences to store the printed word into memory and turn it into a sight word. So what does phonics instruction? Does phonics instruction work with deaf and hard of hearing children? It seems to. So what is it? It's explicit, systematic instruction that seems to be crucial to learning to read. The National Literacy Panel and National Early Literacy Panel 2 came up with a strong statement that phonics instruction is crucial for hearing children learning to read. And research with deaf children with functional hearing shows that phonics instruction also improves their children's phonological awareness and word reading abilities. So I've listed some possibilities on this slide. Direct instruction or reading mastery has been shown in several studies to work with deaf children in improving their word reading and phonological awareness. Foundations for literacy, I mentioned that because Dr. Tucci is giving a webinar. That's one that a bunch of us are, myself, Dr. Easterbrooks, Carol Connor, and Stacy Tucci have all been involved in developing. And I have a 3rd instruction on here called Sound Partners. That is not a program that's been used with deaf children, but it is a program that has evidence-based that works for struggling readers for hearing children. And I think it the way it works would be helpful with deaf children too. So take a look at those programs. I've spent a lot of time on word reading, but we know that's not reading. Learning to read also involves language, and it's just as important. So don't think if you adopt a phonics program in your classroom that you're done. Of course you're not done. You have to, especially with deaf children enter school with deficits frequently in language and experiences. So all of these areas, background knowledge, vocabulary, syntax, verbal reasoning, may all need to be targets of your instruction. And you have 2 webinars, one by Dr. Antia and one by Dr. Easterbrooks, that will give you more in-depth look on how you can do that in your classroom. Now let's turn to children who sign. And CLAD researchers really believe, and so do other people, that children who sign do not learn through the same processes as children who have functional hearing. That they, yes, simple view of reading needs to be thought of as the framework for reading. Children need word recognition, they need language, but how those things interact and result in reading is different. Children who sign are in a situation of bilingualism. They need to read English, but their language is in ASL. There are a lot of challenges here. One obvious one is there's no obvious phoneme grapheme correspondence. I just said phonics and alphabetic principle is crucial to acquiring good word recognition skills, but that doesn't happen when they're signing. Vocabulary and grammar are different. And so the situation is particularly challenging for teachers. And one of the quotes that I like, one of the ideas that I like, comes from Hermans, Ormel, and Noors, where they say good sign language skills can serve as a mediator for learning to read a second language in other words, English, but only when teachers explicitly cultivate that transfer. So you need to explicitly be aware of how children can use their ASL skills to read English. So let's think about how that might be. So starting with the simple view of reading again, let's look at word recognition. What we need to be sight words is you have to have your printed words, the sign, and the meaning. Now, there's no relation on the phoneme level between print and sign, so you might be tempted to revert back to flashcards and have whole word and just show them lots of words and have them sign them to you and have them tell you what it means. It only works for very smart children. This is a real roadblock for deaf children. And people think because we have not tried to develop instruction that would work with deaf children, they're stymied. So what are the alternatives to sight words? Well, one actually is phonological recoding. How do you do that? Well, you can use visual kinesthetic representations of spoken phonology. So Trezick and her colleagues have done a lot of research on using visual phonics. That's when you, all of you are, I'm sure, familiar with that, where you have hand shapes that correspond to the phonemes of a language, or really correspond to how you articulate the sounds of the language. And so the hope is that when they use visual phonics to sound out cat, and they know that that has 3 phonemes, that they'll then be able to create, I think, a spoken phonology in their head of that word and relate the spoken word, the printed word, to that spoken phonology. Lip reading is another area where some deaf children are very good about seeing spoken phonology on their lips, and therefore they can use that to form that phonological representation in their head. And if you do phonics with them, they can use that phonological information to decode print. So is that possible? And these people who are using these are usually using a phonics program developed for hearing children or developed for deaf children with functional hearing and teaching the alphabetic principle as would be done for them. Does it work? Well, I'm sure it works for some children. Some children, you know them when you see them, have a good, even though they can't hear spoken phonology, they seem to represent English, and they can use that to decode words. But many deaf children can't. They don't seem, these visual representations and kinesthetic representations don't seem sufficient to develop that spoken phonology. And so decoding words into spoken English doesn't work because they don't know spoken English. So what CLAD is, team members are developing is trying to see if there's an alternative representation of that sublexical structure of words that can serve to chunk words, printed words, into its syllables and break it down into chunks so they can remember that. And our perspective is that fingerspelling is the route to do that. Fingerspelling has a one-to-one mapping with letters. When you fingerspell a word, there's evidence that it has a more robust memory system of words than print alone. So when you combine print with fingerspelling, you'll remember those convert them into sight words more quickly than if you just use flashcards. Luckily, I don't have to, it's pretty complex. We have pretty good evidence for this, but I don't have to tell you it because Dr. Schick is going to tell it all to you all in their webinar. Okay, so on this slide, you can see the picture of how we recognize words, and there's the printed word, and I've inserted letter fingerspelling correspondences in place of letter phoneme correspondences. So we're saying that fingerspelling is an alternative, that it follows the same principle of letter phoneme correspondences, is that children learn the correspondence between letters and chunks of letters and how you fingerspell them. And then that leads to the sign and the meaning. So in addition to word recognition, of course, you have the whole issue of language and the issue of bilingualism. So under vocabulary, you have multiple signs for an English word. You also have some words that have no sign, so children have to learn to fingerspell those words. Under grammar, you have to learn English grammar through print. rather than through their native language, and you have to relate it to their native language or their L1 ASL grammar. Dr. Easterbrooks will be talking to you more in her webinar. And then you have verbal reasoning. And verbal reasoning is an interesting area because most people believe that conceptual knowledge and understanding, for instance, how you understand a story, is not specific to a language. So if a child can understand a story and can talk about a story in ASL, their native language, that can be used as a means to cultivate and understand the English. Once you've done the word recognition and you've put those words together, knowing the grammar, you then can talk about it in their native language and use their native language as a means for deeper understanding of that native language. So I've heard the term that conceptual knowledge travels with you. It's not specific to a language. Okay, so now it's time just to reflect on what we've been talking about. And I want you to think about these questions. What strategies do your children use when reading words and passages? What strategies do you explicitly teach them? And are there some that are more or less successful? Is there a way you cannot encourage children to guess words? Because we know guessing words does not lead to good sight word recognition. And then, because this is part of what the webinar is about, if you're part of the SYNC webinar, put a question for me on the discussion board that I can answer about what we've been talking about. Now, what's your take-home message? While reading is complex, it's helpful to be mindful of the two components of reading, word recognition and language. Both are necessary, but neither is sufficient, and both require explicit, intentional instruction. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this, and I will see you in the fall online.